So welcome back everyone, and what we're going to be studying today is going to be control flow in Python. So control flow conditional statements are used to execute a specific block of code based on a condition. Think of it like the traffic light system that exists within a crossway. So based on the light, whether it's red or green, the traffic will decide to go on that particular direction. So similarly, in Python, using if, else, and else if, you can decide on which block of code to be executed during your operations. So let's get into it. Right. So before we get into coding, we need to understand a set of keywords that exist in control flows in Python. So the first keyword is the if condition. So the if keyword will be followed up with some sort of a conditional statement. And if that particular conditional statement is met, then this block of code is going to be executed. And then you can also follow it up with a different condition, and to tell Python, okay, this is the condition that you need to check, you will have to use the elif keyword. So the elif keyword can be followed up with a different condition, which is quite different from this condition. And if this is not met, then Python will check this, and if this is met, then it's going to be executing this block of code. If none of these are met, then it's going to be executing this block of code. Okay, so these are the set of keywords that exist when it comes to conditional statements in Python. Now, let's put this into an example so that we understand it better. So let's say that we have set x is equal to 1, and we are going to be checking the condition. If x is greater than 0, then we are going to be printing x is positive. If x is equal to 0, then we are going to say x is 0. And if none of these conditions are met, then we are going to go and execute the else statement. So if I was to run this, you will see that x is actually positive simply because it hits this particular condition, and since it is satisfied, it will print x is positive. Let's set x equal to 0. When we set x equal to 0, it checks this condition that's not met, so that it goes to the next condition and then print x is equal to 0 or x is 0. Let's now change this to -1. Then it will execute this block of code simply because this condition was not met and this condition was not met. Thus, the only thing that is available is to execute this particular block of code. Now, quite interestingly, you can add as much elif statements as possible, and let's try to add this this condition, which is x is equal to 1. We want to print x is 1. Look what happens when we set x is equal to 1. Now, instead of printing this, it has actually printed this block of code. The simple reason behind it is Python executes code line by line. So at the very beginning, it reaches this particular condition and check if this is satisfied. And since it is satisfied, it will print this particular block of code. Similarly, what you need to understand is that it did not go to this level simply because since this was already executed, and that is something that you need to be quite aware about, because you're going to add code that is going to be redundant if the condition is already met at a previous level. Okay. Now let's try to look into nested ifs. So nested if is basically when you try to add an if condition, and within that particular if condition, you have another if condition that is nested. So what is happening is initially it will check this particular condition, and if that is satisfied, then it will go inside this block of code. And since it also has an if condition, it will check if this particular condition is met, and then it will execute this if it is true. If it is false, then it will execute this. So that is basically what nested if is. So at the very beginning, if this condition 1 was not met at all, then it will go and execute this particular block of code. So let's put this into an example as well. So let's say that we have set the applicant's age being equal to 17 and has a driver's license is equal to false. So we are going to be checking initially if the applicant's age is greater than or equal to 18. If that is satisfied, if that condition is true, then we are going to be checking if he has a driver's license. If not, we will be printing this particular block of code. If it does, then we are going to be printing congrats hired, right? If the applicant's age was not greater than 18, then it's going to be printing this particular block of code because this condition was not met. So if I was to execute this, you see that this particular block of code was executed simply because this initial condition was not met. But let's set this to 18. Now it's going to be, when we run it, it's going to be executing this particular block of code simply because the first condition was met, but has driver's license was not met. So this becomes false. So then this block of code is executed. So let's try and do something like this. So if I was to keep this at 17 and if I do true here, right? Then of course it's going to print congrats, you are hired. What if I change this to 17? What happens? Well, what happens is even though this is now meeting, even though this particular variable is meeting the condition specified within this block, since the initial if condition was not met, it's not going to go into this block of code, and what it will execute is this particular block of code. So keep in mind, so this is how if nested ifs work. You will initially check a specific condition, and if that is satisfied, then you will go to another set of if conditions, and based on how you want to execute, you can assign the set of conditions within that if. Next, what we have to learn is how to use logical operators with if conditions. So logical operators are and, or, not, and so forth, right? So if you want two conditions to be satisfied, and then if only those two conditions are satisfied and you want to execute a specific block of code, you can use the and condition. If one of these conditions are to be met and if one of them are met, then you want to execute a code, then you can use the or one. If you do not want that particular condition to be met, then you can use the keyword not or the logical operator not. So let's put this into examples. So initially we are going to set is employed equal to true, and the salary is going to be set at 150,000. Okay, and when we execute this, what you will see is it's going to be executing this block of code simply because the first condition was met and the second condition was met. Thus, it's going to be printing this block of code. If I was to change this to 15,000, okay, now it's 15,000, you will see that it's going to be printing this particular block of code because one of the conditions was not met. The or conditions work similarly, but either if one of these conditions is met, then it's going to print this particular block of code. So let's say now here we have set has own business to true and is employed to false. Okay, so only one of them is meeting the defined criteria. So then you will see that it's actually executing this block of code because one of them has been met. But let's say now we are going to be setting both of them to false. Since none of them are met, so none of the conditions are met, then it's going to be printing this. Okay, even if we set both of them to true, right, it will be executing this because either it's one or both has been satisfied. Thus it's going to be executing this block of code. The not works a little different. So if this is false, then this is going to be printed. So here we have set is employed equal to false, and since it is not meeting, then we are going to be printing this. If I set this to true, you will see that since this particular thing is true, and since you don't want it to be true, you will say no taxes. So that's how you utilize logical operators with conditional statements in Python. Okay, so we're going to go into another aspect of control flows in Python, which is loops. So a loop is used to execute a block of code repeatedly, allowing you to perform a task multiple times without duplicating code. So there are two types of loops within Python. One is the for loop and the other one is the while loop. The for loop is basically going to be iterating over a sequence like a string, a tuple, a list, or a range. But the cool thing about it is once the sequence ends, the for loop is going to stop iterating. So you can have a stopping criteria, but keep in mind when the sequence ends, the for loop stops iterating. So let's put this into an example. So as I said, you need to initially specify a sequence and then you're going to be iterating each of these items within that specific sequence. So let's take range for an example. If you want to print numbers from 0 to 4, what you would do is you would say for I in range 5. And what it will do is it will print the sequence one by one, going through each item that is specified within this particular sequence. So let's say for an example that you have defined a list and you want to print each of the items within this list one by one. So in that case, you will have to iterate through that particular list one by one. And for that purpose, you can use the for loop in which you will say for items in fruits, which where this particular key item is going to refer to each of these elements, and when you print them, it will print each of those items one by one. Similarly, you can also loop over a sequence called a string as well. So a string in Python is considered as a sequence. And what it will do is it will iterate through each of these letters one by one. And then since we are asking it to print, it will print it. Okay. Then we have the while loop. Now the for loop is the for loop will end when the sequence ends. The while loop is not considering a sequence but rather a condition. Until the condition is met, it's going to continue to execute the block of code iteratively. Okay, so let's say we set count equals 0 here. And while the count is less than 5, we are going to print the count. So if there can be cases where you set a loop that does not stop at all, which is going to be a problem. So here we need to make sure that there is a stopping criteria, a condition that will be met so that this particular loop will be stopped. So what we are going to be doing here is we're going to check if the count is less than 5. We are also going to make sure that we increment the count, which is initially set at 0, one by one through each iteration. So here what is happening is we're going to check if the count is less than 5. We're going to print the count. Then we're going to add 1 to the count. So this is what is happening. We're just going to put it in a very easy way to write. So when we execute it, you see first the count was 0, so that was printed. And then what we have done is we're going to be add 1. That is why the second print it's going to be, or the second iteration, the what was printed was 1. And likewise, until this count became 5, it has printed those values. Okay, so that's one way to stop a while loop, right? The other is break and continue. Please understand these are important keywords. So what break does is it's going to exit the loop before it is fully completed. So we would set a condition, and if that particular condition is met while the loop was executing, then we are going to break out of that loop. So let's say for an example, we are going to say for I in range 5, which is basically going to iterate through from values from 0 to 4, and we're going to set a condition saying if I is equal to 3, break. Okay, so you're going to prematurely break out of the sequence using the keyword break. So if I was to run this, you see it actually printed 0, right? Because it started there, then it went to 1 and 2, and once it went to 2, when it came to the third one, when it came to 3, when I equals 3, what happens was this particular condition was ticked off and then it broke out of the loop. So if you want to stop it prematurely, then you can use the break keyword. So this is also applicable in while condition as well. So let's say for an example, we take the previous example here. Okay. What we do here is, instead of the condition saying, okay, while count is equal to 5, we can also say, uh, let's say here, we say if count is equal to 3 break. So what happens here is, when we print it, you see when the count was 3, it went into this particular condition, checked it, and it broke out. And instead of printing all 4, it actually broke from the loop when the count hit 3. Got it? Right. The other one is continue. Continue is where you use to skip the current iteration and go to the next iteration. So in this case, let's say for an example, we are going to be ranging over 5, and you initially go and check, okay, so 0 is okay, then 1 is okay, and when we came to the second one, instead of printing it, we say continue, which means that it's going to jump and skip that particular loop and go to the skip that particular iteration and go to the next iteration. So that is where you use continue. So if you want to skip a specific iteration, while the use of a condition, then you can use the continue keyword. So if you were to do this here, you see that we have the while loop. While this is particular thing is true, we are going to set the counter equals to 1. We're going to keep on continuously printing the counter until it is 5, and if it was, then we are going to be breaking it. So this is simply how the break and continue works. Just keep in mind, break is used to prematurely exit a specific loop by the use of a condition. Continue is to skip that current iteration if a specific condition is met. So, all in all, we learned about control flows. We started off by learning about if conditions, then we moved on to nested if conditions, then we learned how to attach logical operators within the if conditions, then we moved on to loops, we learned about for loops, we learned about while loops, and we also learned about the keywords break and continue, which is going to be essential when it comes to writing good code. So let's um, learn a few more things in the coming episodes. So join us again in these set of videos. Thank you.